From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Britain mourns the death of Queen Elizabeth II as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen goes to Michigan to defend President Biden's economic record. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel. Welcome to you both. After 7 decades on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II died peacefully on Thursday, ending the reign of Britain's longest-serving monarch. And Joe, you're in London where you've lived for some years. What is the scene there as the country remembers Queen Elizabeth and transitions now to King Charles III?
I think that people are really still very much in shock about the news yesterday. Certainly she was 96 years old, and clear for a while that her health was starting to deteriorate a bit, and people had known on an intellectual level that she wouldn't be with the country forever. But I think still the event has come as a terrible surprise, and that is because of the deep affection that the British people held for the Queen and still hold for her and will do for quite a long time to come. I think that part of that is consequence of her personal longevity and her long tenure on the throne. Tens of millions of people alive in Britain today have not been alive at a time when someone else was the monarch. And so I think that she was very much a part of the public life here, and also very much a part of the way that British people have thought about their country, what it means to be British, what Britishness is. And the loss of that is really palpable.
As a historical figure, there were a couple of facts that stuck out to me in the coverage. Queen Elizabeth being the last head of state who served in World War II. She had met 13 U.S. presidents and was on the cover of Time magazine in 1929. There were also a few lines of Boris Johnson's speech that stood out to me. He said, "I speak for other ex-PMs when I say that she helped to comfort and guide us, as well as the nation, because she had the patience and the sense of history to see that troubles come and go and that disasters are seldom as bad as they seem." And then he added this, he said, "One final quality, her humility, her single-bar electric fire, Tupperware-using refusal to be grand, and unlike us politicians with our outriders and our armor-plated convoys, I can tell you as a direct eyewitness that she drove herself in her own car with no detectives and no bodyguard, bouncing at alarming speed over the Scottish landscape, to the total amazement of the ramblers and tourists we encountered." And in that spirit, there's a story that's been going around. This is not a new clip, but it's a royal aide, Richard Griffin, explaining an encounter that he had with some tourists. And this was in June during the Royal Jubilee, told to Sky News.
And normally on these picnic sites, you meet nobody. But there was 2 hikers coming towards us, and the Queen would always stop and say hello. And it was 2 Americans on a walking holiday. And it was clear from the moment that we first stopped, they hadn't recognised the Queen, which is fine. And the American gentleman was telling the Queen where he came from, where they were going to next, and where they'd been to in Britain. And I could see it coming, and sure enough, he said to Her Majesty, "And where do you live?" And she said, "Well, I live in London, but I've got a holiday home just the other side of the hills." And he said, "Well, how often have you been coming up here?" "Oh," she said, "I've been coming up here ever since I was a little girl, so over 80 years. And you could see the clogs thinking. He said, "Well, if you've been coming up here for 80 years, you must have met the Queen." And as quick as a flash says, "Well, I haven't, but Dick here meets her regularly." So the guy said to me, "Oh, you've met the Queen, what's she like?" And because I was with her a long time and I knew I could pull a leg, I said, "Oh, she can be very cantankerous at times, but she's got a lovely sense of humour." Anyway, the next thing I knew, this guy comes around, put his arm around my shoulder, and before I could see what was happening, he gets his camera, gives it to the Queen, and says, "Can you take a picture of the 2 of us?" Anyway, we swapped places, and I took a picture of them with the Queen, and we never let on, and we waved goodbye. And then Her Majesty said to me, "I'd love to be a fly on the wall when he shows those photographs to the friends in America, and hopefully someone tells him who I am."
Kim, I love that story, and all I can say is, what a sovereign.
How amazing. I know. I have now heard that a couple of times today, and it is one of my favorite things that I've heard since all of this happened on what is otherwise a very sad day. But there's so many stories like that, in fact, and the humility involved to go through a moment like that, I think, says a great deal about her. And I think that that is kind of the story of her life, because people talk a lot about her modesty, for instance, But at the same time, when you really stop and think about it, that modesty was also paired with an incredible amount of strength and smarts. Because the fact that we're sitting here and talking about Queen Elizabeth, I just would like to step back. It didn't ever have to be this way, right? I mean, I was privileged to live for a few years in London, and it took me a while to wrap my head around the central idea of the monarchy in the British culture. And I mean, as a young girl, I, like so many millions of young girls, had seen Princess Diana's wedding, right? The fairy tale version. Then you live there and you realize how central, and then you stop to think about how amazing that is, because she essentially was there through the transition from what was an imperialistic country to a kind of modern culture. And whereas so many other countries discarded or really relegated their monarchs along the way, she managed through just grit and intelligence and really playing this the right way pretty much all the time to maintain the monarchy's central role in this otherwise functioning modern democracy, where it wasn't just that she had some sort of ceremonial duties here or there, but literally was a part of the fabric of the country, and the nation looked up to her and felt the necessity of the monarchy to still be there. Now, not every Briton feels that way, but obviously a huge number do. I'll be really, really fascinated to see how Charles now navigates that, if he can manage to keep that incredible balance between remaining relevant, but not being overbearing and not being a sort of institution that the nation actively comes to view as a problem and one that needs to go.
And Joe, can you help also flesh out what role the monarchy now plays for American listeners who are less than familiar with this? Because the Queen Elizabeth did not exercise political or executive powers. So can you just give us a sense of what role she played? I mean, I've heard a lot of people say in recent days that she was a stabilizer for the British constitutional system?
Well, I think there are two dimensions to that question. One is sort of the formal constitutional role, although keeping in mind that the United Kingdom, unlike the US, does not have a formal written constitution. But sort of the role that has evolved over time in that sense is that she is the head of state. So formally, after there are parliamentary elections and a majority in parliament coalesces behind a prime minister, technically it's still the crown that appoints that prime minister and all of the other cabinet secretaries who then serve at the crown's pleasure. And of course, that constitutional role has been mediated by democratic principles over the centuries, so that Britain is still very much a modern democracy now. But certainly that was always viewed as a stabilizing role, and the sovereign would meet with the prime minister about once a week. And we have never really had any sense of what goes on in those conversations, but there has been perhaps a sense that the Queen would advise prime ministers, particularly if they sought her help, and was also keenly aware of her role in terms of lending legitimacy to the government, especially in the absence of a written constitution. But that all pales in comparison to the much harder to quantify role of holding the country together. And here I think that it does become this much more mysterious factor of the relationship that she had between herself and the people of the United Kingdom and of the Commonwealth, and the mutual affection in which they've all held each other, which is the thing, even when the formal political ties have sometimes become very complicated or strained, that affection was the thing that could knit together the country. So, I mean, even here in the British Isles and in the United Kingdom, you have the four entities, Northern Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland. They oftentimes have contentious relationships. Scotland had an independence referendum as recently as 8 years ago. And yet the common affection that the people felt for the Queen, the respect they felt for the institution of the monarchy they all shared, played a crucial role in holding the country together.
And that task will now fall to Queen Elizabeth's son, formerly Prince Charles, now King Charles III. And let's listen to a piece of his speech today.
As the Queen herself did with such unswerving devotion, I too now solemnly pledge myself, throughout the remaining time God grants me, to uphold the constitutional principles at the heart of our nation. And wherever you may live in the United Kingdom, or in the realms and territories across the world, and whatever may be your background or beliefs. I shall endeavor to serve you with loyalty, respect, and love, as I have throughout my life.
So, Kim, as you mentioned a moment ago, one of the questions that people have been debating is whether the now King Charles will rise to this occasion. And one of the points people often made about Queen Elizabeth was that it was really hard to read her. She was not outspoken. You didn't know her personal views of these issues or of politics. And Prince Charles has been a little bit of the reverse. Here's a headline from April. Prince Charles says we have to stop poisoning ourselves and do something about climate change. And so, Kim, he's been a little bit of a more polarizing figure, at least in his former role.
Well, a lot more polarizing, and not just because of his views either. Obviously, his history with Diana and then Camilla, and he's certainly been a problem that's brought more negative headlines to the crown than positive ones. And I know, having spoken to some Britons, they weren't actually waiting for this day. They were actually hoping Queen Elizabeth would go on longer and longer. And maybe there was even some hope that they kind of hoped that maybe he would be skipped over and that this would go on to his son. But here he is. I thought it was notable that he began his address to the nation of repeating, in essence, or bringing back to mind Elizabeth's very famous address on her 21st birthday, when in a speech broadcast from Cape Town, she said, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." And that's obviously something that defined her. He said something similar about pledging himself to lifelong service. I did think it was interesting, that little clip, and going to Joe's point, that even in today's day and age, he also felt the need to repledge himself to the parliamentary government and the system of constitutional privileges, just in case anybody out there thought he might start getting all kingy and taking over England. I don't think anyone thought that, but apparently this was something he felt the need to do. He also noted in his address that he is going to have to step back some from all of his charities and issues and leave them more in the hands of others, given the new duties he will have. And I guess that will be the question, is how much is he willing to actually do this? This is what he has spent most of his adult life doing, becoming more outspoken about it as time went on, especially climate issues, environmental issues, occasionally jumping into the political fray. He may well think that that is not a polarizing issue, that maybe it's just something that all right-thinking people should do, but not so. Environmentalism is an incredibly contentious subject. So will he be able to refrain from that? Will he be able to continue to unite? Or will he, through his actions and statements, feel as though people have to take sides over the monarchy? And that's one thing Elizabeth did very, very well, by being very careful and quiet about her politics herself. She allowed everyone to appreciate the Queen as the leader of all Britons. And if he starts making people take sides, there could be some real issues for the monarchy.
One final thought on this. If some of the ties within the United Kingdom and also within the greater Commonwealth were bound up in belief and devotion to Queen Elizabeth II, then does the transition to King Charles potentially put them at risk? And that could mean emboldened belief in another Scottish independence referendum. It could mean referenda in some Commonwealth countries to become republics and leave the Commonwealth. Joe, do you think those things are possible or likely? And if so, are they issues that Americans ought to care about from our standpoint here?
I think that this is something that we're going to have to think about, certainly not immediately. If you do start seeing this sort of breaking up or breaking apart here, it's probably a project of years and not months. And I think that people probably also will be prepared to give King Charles an opportunity to settle into the role. I mean, it's interesting with the clip of his address that we heard a few minutes ago. I thought that it was a very Elizabethan conception of monarchy and the way in which he was trying to speak directly to the people both of the United Kingdom and of the Commonwealth countries and various of the realms, to start immediately trying to establish for himself the kind of personal connection with people that she had, because that is the key ingredient here. And I think the key fact of Queen Elizabeth's reign was that she personally was often more popular in many of these places than the institution of the monarchy itself was. So I think that what is really going to determine the outcome of a lot of these questions moving forward will be whether he can build the same kind of reservoir of affection for himself. If he can't, it will create a very complicated situation, because certainly, just if you want to talk in purely political or economic terms, America has developed a very close relationship with the United Kingdom and with many of the countries that are part of that orbit, including Canada and Australia. No one is going to suggest that that is all going to fall apart if they decide that they want more separation from the Crown or from the United Kingdom. But I think that we do need to be aware of the possibility that some of those relationships within that alliance will change over time, and not necessarily assume that things will always continue as they've done.